Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the 2008 biography by John Meacham, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. Alright, John Meacham, someone that we have not talked about yet on this channel. Fairly well-known biographer at this point, Tennessee-born fellow, really came to prominence from a journalistic standpoint. Had a background in English literature. I believe that was his major in college. Got exposure as the managing editor of Newsweek for a period of time. He also worked at Random House as well. And in the 2000s, started developing a reputation as having a penchant for writing about U.S. presidents, as so many of these folks do. The book Franklin and Winston, which I have not read, about Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, is a fairly popular one. But really, this book, American Lion, which, as I said, came out in 2008, is kind of the linchpin in the thing that has solidified Meacham as one of the great and renowned presidential biographers of this day and age. This was an extremely popular book when it came out. It won the Pulitzer Prize for biography or autobiography. Very highly lauded, and you can find it pretty much anywhere. Now, Meacham has written a number of other biographies since then. He wrote one on Thomas Jefferson. He did an authorized biography of George Bush. And most recently, he did one on Abraham Lincoln called And Then There Was Light. And There Was Light. And the reason that I'm talking about this Andrew Jackson biography, because it's chronologically out of order, is because the Meacham Lincoln book is my next one that I have on my list. And I had a couple of other Meacham books sitting around, this Jackson one and the Jefferson one, that I'd heard good things about. And so I really wanted to kind of read these first, just kind of get them out of the way quick before getting to the Lincoln work, since I understand that all three of these are apparently excellent. Now, Andrew Jackson, we've talked about on the channel before. I reviewed the H.W. Brands biography of him about 2 years ago at this point, which was a video that, the channel was extremely small back then and still is, relatively speaking, but definitely got some backlash from people because of the words that I used that were not super kind towards Jackson. And really, I think this is what you have to grapple with when talking about any Andrew Jackson biography, but I think this John Meacham one especially, is Andrew Jackson is a very polarizing figure. Again, if you go back 30 to 40 years, give or take, and think about how American history was taught back then, Jackson was viewed as a mercurial figure, but still one of the great presidents because he was viewed as a strong leader, a powerful force, and someone to be reckoned with. That, yes, he could be like a little bit off the wall and made some unusually rash decisions for that time, but ultimately his presidency was for the greater good of everybody involved. Now, in the last 30 to 40 years or so, I think with the rise of more kind of equitable telling of history, as we've seen the voices of other communities become more centralized in the narrative, become more equalized in the narrative, specifically Native Americans and indigenous folks, the reputation of Jackson has taken a pretty sizable hit. And so we're left with now, I think, this general kind of tug of war where there are people who confidently rank Jackson as one of the worst presidents of all time, and people who are still massive proponents of Jackson that think that his responsibility for all these things has been blown out of proportion and that the good he did outweighs the bad. And my personal stance from kind of evaluating all of this is, I think you can have an opinion that says, ultimately, yes, Jackson did some things that were beneficial for the country. Like, yes, you have to give him credit for leading us through the most difficult, the greatest secession crisis that the country faced prior to the Civil War. You have to give him credit for what he did to kind of push through that, because a lot of other people probably would have folded and would have caved. But you can also acknowledge that the guy was kind of a maniac, and a lot of his number of his policies, most specifically that his American Indian policy, was resulted in quite a few, thousands upon thousands of deaths. And you can't undo that. You can't really ignore that. And it's hard to say the good outweighs the bad in that type of a situation when the bad results in that many thousands of lives being lost for no particular reason. But in any case, Jackson is a very complicated figure. Now, one thing about John Meacham that I'm kind of noticing just in general, kind of looking more into him, is that he seems to be a guy who doesn't like to ruffle feathers very much. He's someone who seems to come from a very like centrist ideal, a vaguely Democratic leaning person who supported Joe Biden, that sort of thing, a Joe Biden Democrat, if you will. And this comes out in American Lion. As far as the book itself, this is a narrative that I think kind of tries to have its cake and eat it too. And I wasn't in love with it, I'm going to be honest. Now, I don't need a biography or a biographer to be partisan at all. I don't need that. I don't usually want that. And I don't need him to be, the biographer, in this case, him or her, to take such a pointed stance on something to where the opinion that they are saying outweighs everything else, right? I don't need that sort of like very hyper partisan, hyper polarized perspective on a person's life. But sometimes, like, you need to have something. You need to have some sort of an argument. You need to have some sort of stance. And the Meacham narrative on Jackson kind of seems to be trying to satisfy both sides. And it does so in a way that doesn't feel like there's a lot of conviction behind it. It's very much kind of, we're going to get in, we're going to tell Jackson's story. It's not a cradle to grave biography either, which there's no problem with that. It kind of rushes through his early life. The focus is on the 8 years in the White House. And then once he leaves, you get like a chapter or two with him, and then he dies. And so the focus is on his presidency, which makes total sense. There's no problem with that. But again, it feels like Meacham kind of goes in, he kind of tells the story, and then he kind of goes out. And the general sense you're left with is, okay, well, I understand what happened, but I don't necessarily have a great idea of what I think about what happened, nor do I feel like I understand what the author wants me to think. Again, I don't need to be an empty vessel that is going to always be convinced by an author of something, but I do like to see at least a pointed, like, argument. I do want to be able to at least see why the author wrote the book in question. And this narrative to me came across as a little bit of like devil's advocacy, where you get kind of the mixture of like acknowledging the bad. Some people refer to this book as a hagiography. I don't agree with that. Meacham does acknowledge the irrational side of Jackson and the impact that some of his policies had, although not in great detail. He doesn't actually talk a lot about the Trail of Tears in this book, which is a little bit disappointing. But you have that, but then you also have Meacham trying to also highlight some of the other sides of Jackson. So again, talking about how he was actually very effective at governing, that actually his leadership style was very calculated. He wasn't necessarily the sort of lion-hearted, very like impulsive individual that he was sometimes framed as, that he was actually very calculated in a lot of decisions he made. And I think there's validity in that. But it also kind of mixes with like pieces where Jackson is trying to be painted, like he's being painted as a good family man and that sort of thing. So many pieces about his relationship with like his family, the book starts with like his relationship with his wife and the death of his wife prior to his inauguration. And that kind of sets the tone for this subplot with like Emily Donaldson and, kind of her time in the White House and her back and forth and her battle with like Peggy Eaton and stuff like that. That whole scandal, that takes up a lot of time in this narrative. And I'm not going to say that it's not incredibly important in some ways to his story, but it does feel like there is a conscious attempt at like humanizing him. And that conscious attempt comes from trying to push back against some of the negativity that has been spread around for Jackson specifically. And I don't know. I didn't necessarily find myself super compelled by any of it. It's effectively done. The writing is solid. It's very approachable. Another thing about Meacham's works that I'm noticing is that he documents quite in a lot of detail in his footnotes, to the point where his footnotes comprise a massive percentage of the book. American Lion is something like 600 pages, give or take, but like a third of that, give or take, is footnotes. Same thing for the Thomas Jefferson book that I'm reading right now. So like, trust me, it's not as much of a, there's not as much to get through. It's not as intimidating as it looks on the surface. So it's competently done. It's clearly well researched. There's clearly like time that has been spent in it. And I don't think it's a reaction against any other like specific narrative against Jackson. Like, I don't think it's a reaction against H.W. Brands and his more critical portrayal of Jackson. Brands, I think, is even a consultant on this book. But it just feels like it is trying to make something that is generally palatable to everybody, where the average person can pick it up and read it and have no real major issues with the work. In essence, it's popular biography in a nutshell. And that has its place, for sure. I won't deny that. And I would not at all say that this book is bad. Not even that mediocre, really. But compared to other works that I have reviewed on this channel, that I have read just in general, I was maybe a little bit surprised, given this book's reputation, how ultimately kind of inessential it felt. It felt like I got a lot more value and a lot more passion and interest and intrigue from the H.W. Brands biography. And while I've not read like the Robert Remini biography of him, which is like a 3-volume set, I have no doubt that I would get more from that 3-volume set as well. So it's hard for me to say that I'd recommend this. I mean, again, this is such a popular book. Sold so many copies, and you can probably find a used one in a bookstore for like a couple dollars, like in a Goodwill or something. And, you know, in that situation, yeah, of course you take a chance on that, because you're absolutely getting bang for your buck in that case. But I feel like you can dig around on the internet and find better Jackson biographies than this. Even if they're a tiny bit older, I think there are still others that do a better job grappling with the morality of Jackson's presidency and the balance between that morality and that efficacy. There are better books out there that grapple with that than this one. So take that for what it is. It's a very like tentative recommendation. If you're just looking for a very basic access point, just know I think you could probably find better out there. But with that, I want to thank you all so much for watching this video. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot. And I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.